You're listening to the Lost Geographer podcast. This is episode 20 on fear as a barrier to literacy.
In our modern globalized society, understanding geography and culture is crucial if you want to succeed in life. Unfortunately, many people are still unaware of the world around them, which is fueled by media that are focused only on profits, clicks, and promoting agendas rather than providing accurate information. Here at the Lost Geographer, we aim to promote geographic and cultural literacy through education and travel by bypassing the media. We have guests who talk about their own countries from a native perspective, travellers telling their stories and lessons, and related topics that will aid you on your journey towards geographic and cultural literacy. Get the raw, candid truth about the world we live in and understand your place in it. Because at the end of the day, it's your world. Own it.
Hey everybody, so while this podcast and site do increase your geographic and cultural literacy, the best way to attain literacy is through travel. Now, I understand that many people think traveling is expensive and stressful, and understandably so. However, it doesn't have to be this way. Traveling can be cheap and relatively stress-free if you know the right places to look for flights and already have an understanding of common travel mistakes. If you want to learn how, check out The Ultimate Guide to Smart Budget Traveling. It's a video course that will teach you how to save hundreds on your next vacation and thousands throughout your life by showing you how to make different rewards programs work for you and introduce you to sites that have prices you could have only dreamed of. I will show you how I've done things such as book transatlantic and transcontinental flights in the US for less than $10, and how I don't pay ATM fees anywhere in the world, and withdraw money according to the exact exchange rate and not get ripped off. Want to learn more? Check out literacy.thelostgeographer.net for more information. Consider it an investment to learn how to invest in experiences to become geographically and culturally literate. Again, you can find it at literacy.thelostgeographer.net. All right, everybody, welcome to the Lost Geographer podcast, where our goal is to promote geographic and cultural literacy. It's your world, own it. I'm your host, Rohit Amruther, founder of the Lost Geographer. You can find us at www.thelostgeographer.net, and in this episode, we are going to talk about fear as a barrier to literacy. So, as I promised a few weeks ago, I'm going to move forward with this sub-series within this podcast that I call Barriers to Literacy. To be honest, I've been a little hesitant to do so lately because of some of these conversations. They can be uncomfortable and controversial with some people. However, the only way we can move forward as a society and as a world toward geographic and cultural literacy is to have these uncomfortable conversations. It's the elephant in the room that we need to address. So for all of you non-native English speakers, elephant in the room basically means it's the big obvious thing that's sitting in the room, but no one wants to address it. It's the thing that everyone's just afraid to talk about. And if we don't address this problem out of fear of just creating discomfort, and nothing's going to happen, honestly. Well, for those of you who don't know about the sub-series that I'm starting, I'll summarize it here, but if you're still not aware of what I hope to do after my little description here, then go to episode 16. I go over it in detail there. Basically, I felt that as a world, we truly don't have a grasp as to why there's so much misunderstanding in the world today. It's either that or we do, but are too afraid to discuss it because these conversations are uncomfortable. And I get it, I do. It's not easy to talk about some of these issues, but at the same time, there's no other way to progress without doing so. I started this series called Barriers to Literacy in order to talk about these different mentalities that are present that impede our geographic and cultural literacy. I believe by doing so, people will truly understand what the problems are. And like I said, these conversations are kind of uncomfortable, and like I said, I hesitated at the possibility of offending people by discussing some of these things. But then again, I just realized that people are always going to get offended no matter what. They're going to get offended at something because feelings are just entirely subjective. It's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. So I guess I just have to do. So listen in as we get started with the first real topic of this series. Again, that was my little description. If you want a better understanding of what's going on, check out episode 16. I go over it in full detail over there and give some examples. So, our first barrier to literacy is fear. Fear. F-E-A-R. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. And so to give you some background on why I think this is important, I was inspired by a piece by Walid Ali, who is an Australian journalist, and this piece was called Send Forgiveness Viral. You can find it on YouTube, and I'll put a link to the show notes on this episode. I highly recommend watching it. I'll summarize it real quick though. Walid Ali is a journalist from Australia who was a Muslim. I believe he's Egyptian in origin. Anyway, this is relevant because in 2016, we've seen a lot of crime stemming from the quote-unquote Islamic world. Bombings, shootings, trucks driving over people. It's crazy. It's scary. I understand the world is a scary place. The majority of these people are quote-unquote Muslims inspired by ISIS, who actually, by the way, aren't Muslim at all, considering that they bombed Medina in Saudi Arabia, which is the second holiest city in all of Islam. If I'm not mistaken, I think that's where Muhammad started his Hajj, or the Hijra, which was the holy journey toward Mecca, which is the holiest city in Islam, where all the Muslims go to after the month of Ramadan, which is known as the Hajj. Anyway, so yeah, and they've also bombed other places in the heavily Muslim Middle East. So he shows a video of Sonia Kruger, an Australian TV personality who called for a ban on Muslims entering Australia. So after she said that, obviously she was met with a lot of backlash. After she supported this proposition, she got a plethora of threats and was forced to withdraw from the limelight for a little bit. However, Ali, who was a Muslim, who was actually directly attacked by that kind of statement, said he forgave her and understood why she was saying the things that she was saying. It's not that Sonia was a bad person, it's just that she was scared. And to those in the rest of the world who share similar ideologies, it's not that they're inherently bad people, they're just scared for their lives. And the funny thing with fear is that fear feeds off fear, which just ends in this downward spiral where people become more and more scared and take more extreme action due to their fear. So Ali describes it as this sort of gravitron, the ride in the amusement park where you're strapped to a wall and you're in a spinny thing and it just keeps twirling and twirling. And because of centripetal acceleration, you're just pinned to the wall and you can't really move. And so that's kind of what he said this fear was like, except the gravitron was spinning faster and people are just not getting off because they're too afraid to. And this is just spinning faster and faster. So he does a better job explaining that analogy on his video, but that's something he said. Anyway, so going back, think about how Kruger feels now after she received all those threats. She can't even show her face anymore and he's even more scared. She'll be less likely to speak her mind, and when we're less likely to speak our mind, less progress gets achieved because we can't say how we're really feeling for the sake of not offending or upsetting anyone, because that might lead to even more threats and even more fear, and we don't want to do that. So this leads to further resentment and withdrawal. Now, let me get one thing straight. I'm not saying being fearful is a bad thing. It's an innate human instinct. It's what kept our ancestors from getting attacked by predators. So, when they went hunting and they would hear noise over there, they would definitely look over and maybe have to run away. So fear is innate in us. However, what is important is acting in the face of fear. It's the relationship you have with fear and how you choose to act in spite of it. Now, if Kruger chose to act differently in spite of her fear, she would realize that people in these Arab countries are normal people who want to live normal, happy lives but can't because of groups like ISIS. A lot of feedback I got on the Syria episode, which I believe was episode 4, is that because of all the media portrayals about the Middle East, you forget that people in Syria actually live normal lives. And Sham, who I had on the episode, described it so well. He described it so well how Syrians are normal people and that they're not all terrorists or they don't all hate the West and that they just want to live normal lives because that's what Syria was used to before Assad and then ISIS and all of this. It's just that their country has just been getting crazy and out of control and have wanted to get out of there. They just want to be safe. They want to feel comfortable. And again, they're acting out of fear too. They don't want to leave though. Like what you have to understand is that they don't want to leave Syria or whatever country they're from in the Middle East because that's their home. That's their home soil, and they know it'll be difficult to start life anew in a foreign country. However, they do want to survive as human beings. That's what we want. We want to survive, and that's their only choice. So, before I go any further, I'm not defending anyone's stance or position, no matter where they stand. I'm just simply explaining their behavior. It's easy to quickly judge someone's actions and get mad at them and react negatively. In fact, I bet some of you are mad at me right now and because you think I'm justifying statements that are either hateful or politically correct. However, to look past that initial feeling, which is in fact fueled by fear, that initial hatred or anger, and understand where people are coming from and why people are saying and doing certain things, you'll realize what the real problems are in the world. It's 2016 and we're all scared. Like, I'm scared. You're probably scared to some degree too. However, that's not keeping me from interacting with Muslims due to the recent terror threats. It's not keeping me from understanding the American police due to all the bad rep they've been getting for being minority killers. I act despite my fear. That brings me to another problem that is occurring in the United States. So we've talked a little bit about Muslims and the problems that they've been having in other countries. We've recently had a wave of police officers in the United States killing unarmed black men. African Americans throughout are blaming police officers of being racist, murderous pigs, and white people are blaming black people of being dangerous thugs. Well, let me tell you something. Let me tell you something about this situation. In that confrontation, when the police officer pulls a black man over and goes over to his driver's side windows, both parties are absolutely frightened. The black man is afraid because he's seeing all the police shootings against unarmed black men in the United States. He feels that he should be protected by the police, but instead feels that he is being targeted and is rightfully so afraid. The police officer is afraid because he sees the way African Americans are rioting against these killings and knows that this man may react violently to the situation. All it takes is a tiny bit of discomfort for the twig to snap and unleash some sort of violent confrontation between the two. Again, I'm not justifying or defending anyone's behavior, just explaining it. But this leads to that downward spiral I was just discussing that creates more fear in the hearts of the two groups and will just divide them even further. I'm not saying that there aren't racists or actual people who want to hurt others. There are. However, they're an incredibly small minority. You gotta understand that most people are good. It's just that most people are also bad at handling fear. And in this age where media agencies, politicians, and religious leaders are using fear to promote agendas and monetarily profit from their fears, it really is no wonder that the world is so divided. It's no wonder that you have extremists rising from every end of the political spectrum. So in the United States, for example, in this last election, people like Bernie Sanders, who was on the far left of the spectrum, and Donald Trump, who many have compared to Hitler, would have never had a fighting chance even 5 years ago, even 4 years ago in the last election. However, Donald Trump is now the frontrunner to become president of the United States. This sentiment is being echoed everywhere. So going back to Australia, there's a woman named Pauline Hanson, who is the far-right representative there, and she is getting a lot of support behind her because she is feeding off the fear of Australians. By the way, speaking of Hitler, that's exactly how he rose to power, striking fear in the hearts of Germans about Jews and blaming them and other external powers for the reason why Germany was in a state of utter impoverishment after World War I. And it didn't help that he led them to economic prosperity, and his rhetoric was becoming more and more accepted, and his rhetoric was based off of fear, and that's why he gained so much power, and that's why all of Germany was behind him. But anyway, in this same way, if Western governments decided to act differently in the face of fear, they wouldn't be reacting to fear with more fear and sending drone strikes to the Middle East. Not only are these drone strikes killing hundreds and thousands of innocent civilians, they're killing humanitarian workers from those countries who were sent over there to help. Like, that's ridiculous. If we had actually looked into the problem in the Middle East as to why so many young men are joining ISIS, we can see that it has nothing to do with Islam or is nothing inherent in the average Arab man to become an ISIS soldier or whatever terrorist. Rather, it has to do with the economic uncertainty that the region has been experiencing. The unemployment rates in these countries are so high, like ridiculously high. They're up around 15 to 20%, and for men, young men in their 20s and 30s, it's higher. It's like 1 in 4 of these men are unemployed. The amount of jobs available is less than the number of men who are looking for jobs. So think about it. If you're a young man who worked hard through college to earn his degree and you were told that your degree was a ticket to job and an income, but had trouble finding a job, you'd be quite frustrated, wouldn't you? And not only that, you'd have external pressures from your parents, from your family. Why aren't you getting a job? Why are you sitting around? Why are you being so lazy? You'd be quite frustrated. I know I would. I can relate because I'm about to graduate from college too, and I'm looking for a job right now. And it's frustrating to have continued to apply to job after job after job to no avail. At that point, you would just be so mentally exhausted and mentally weak that you just take the first real opportunity that will come your way. For most young Arab men, this opportunity comes in the form of groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. For African Muslim men, it would come in the form of groups such as Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab. These groups promise financial and religious salvation. So what I mean by that is they make plenty of false promises such as supporting you, housing you, feeding you, and that when you die fighting for this cause, you will go to heaven and achieve salvation. Not only that, they claim that they'll do the same for your family. So it's like a pretty good deal in a highly religious and economically struggling situations such as this, it seems like a great bargain, doesn't it? And this is how ISIS recruits. This is how all these terrorist organizations recruit. And this is in addition to recruiting others by force. So, if Western governments understood this as the problem, we wouldn't react with drone strikes. Rather, we would move toward investing economically in that region. We would try to provide jobs for these people and help instill an entrepreneurial spirit in these frustrated young men who need it, who can't find jobs. That's the real solution. However, Western governments and their citizens are so blinded by fear that they can't see the real truth. This is what is actually happening, and fear prevents people from seeing it for what it is. I mean, this sort of problem solving, this methodical problem solving can really be applied to plenty of other situations as well. Don't believe me? Well, alright, let's check out a case that happened in a city called Aarhus in Denmark. So I'll put a link to the article describing the situation, but I'll briefly summarize it here. It's actually a case of what many call homegrown terrorism, which described what happened with the Charlie Hebdo shooting in Paris, as well as the Paris and Brussels bombings. It's been a trend that Muslims who were born and raised or moved when they were very young to that country were the perpetrators of these attacks. So Charlie Hebdo, the Paris bombings, and Brussels bombings, these were all Muslim men who were born and raised in Belgium or France, or who were there since they were young. Anyway, back to the Aarhus story. Many Muslim immigrants or children of Muslim immigrants didn't feel welcome in Denmark due to their religion. They felt separated and not a part of the community. They were lonely, so in order to put that in more relevant words, they basically had fear of loneliness, which is fear. So, as a result, many of these Muslim men got together and bonded over this mutual fear of loneliness. Now, they became very close, and groups like ISIS saw this opportunity and took advantage of this and got these people to flee to Syria to become a part of their cause. Normally, Western countries would consider these kinds of people enemies of the state, so if you're born and raised there and then go to Syria to fight with ISIS, then you're an enemy of the state. However, the Danish police in Aarhus took a different route. Basically, what they did is they apologized for the way these men had been treated in Denmark and understood their fear and frustrations. So they went the extra mile and looked at their fears. The police also told these men that they were welcome back in Denmark in any time and would get help finishing school and finding an apartment. Now, the thing is, a lot of these men were surprised by the kindness, and this tactic really did work. So let's look at some numbers to see how effective it was. Starting in 2012, 34 people went from Aarhus to Syria. As far as the police know, 6 were killed and 10 are still over there. Of the 18 that came back home, all showed up at the police office in Aarhus, as did hundreds of other potential radicals, and that is about 330 in total. So think about how many people they prevented from going over to Syria to fight alongside ISIS. That's incredible. And this was just by understanding their fear and realizing that these men were acting out of fear. In addition, since the initial exodus of these young people, very few have left from Aarhus for Syria, even when traffic from the rest of Europe was spiking. Last year in 2015, it was just 1 person. Incredible. So that was quoted directly from the article, by the way, which was written by NPR, National Public Radio in the United States. This model has proven to be so effective that others have actually dubbed it the Aarhus model, and others are actually following it. So this is a great example of how understanding someone's fear can really provide insight into how they're feeling and can really make a change and allow greater understanding, and eventually help us progress toward geographic and cultural literacy. So, let's bring this back to the idea of fear being a barrier to geographic and cultural literacy. Understand that just because someone is afraid and can't control his or her fear does not make him or her a bad person. Sonia Kruger isn't a bad person. The fact that unconscious fear feeds off unconscious fear is what divides people. This downward spiral increases exponentially and is the reason why the world is becoming less and less safe at an alarmingly fast rate. It's fine to initially feel fear. Like I said, it's innate, it's primal, it's a primal instinct. However, when you understand that everybody's afraid, and if they're doing something that you deem questionable, it's because they're afraid. I mean, we're human beings. The vast majority of us are reasonable creatures, and we do things out of reason. However, sometimes fear blinds us from reason. due to its instinctive nature and forces us to make impetuously questionable decisions. Due to the availability of quote-unquote news, media, which I'll slander in another episode, on the internet nowadays, we see horrible things happen and are exposed to more and more fear, which is what is causing the world to become scarier and scarier. So again, watch the video by Walid Ali about sending forgiveness viral, and please send forgiveness viral rather than fear, because we've seen what happens when we send fear viral. That's literally been the last 5 years of the history of this world. And on that note, thank you all for listening to the Lost Geographer podcast and this episode about fear. I know it may have been quite heavy for this podcast from what you're used to, but it's something that needs to be discussed. We'll go back to talking about countries and travelers next week, but every few weeks expect an episode similar to this one to help aid you on your journey toward geographic and cultural literacy. Because at the end of the day, it's your world, own it.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Lost Geographer podcast. Remember to tune in next week for another episode to aid you on your journey towards geographic and cultural literacy. In order to help spread the word, please rate, review, subscribe, and share the podcast so that we can help create a new wave of understanding in our world. Remember, it's your world. Own it.